My name is Charlene Margot, co-founder of the Parent Venture, and we are delighted to have with us tonight Deborah Farmer Kris to talk about how to help children develop an emotional vocabulary. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a topic, and I think I clicked the wrong one. There we go, slideshow, that never gets old for me, I will say. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of emotional literacy, because I think for parents of my generation, I won't say exactly how old I am, this is not an area that my parents, as wonderful as they were particularly focused on. And the more I speak to parents around the country, I feel like many of us are developing our emotional vocabulary along with our children. And let me give you an example that brought this to bear for me. And I'm going to take you back to June 2020, when for 3 months, I had been working while kind of homeschooling my kids, like just about all of you in the room. And one morning, in the rush of getting ready, my son ran in and said he had found this adorable little caterpillar, and he found a jar. He put it in the jar. He found some leaves. I forgot about it. The next morning, his sister looked and said, caterpillar's dead. I washed out the jar. I went on with my day, and I got out of my Zoom meetings in the afternoon, and my son was a mess. He was kicking, he was hitting, he was basically instigating drama however he could. I lost my cool to match his losing his cool. I sent him to my room. I sent him to his room. I sent myself to my room to cool down. And then I circled back after taking some deep breaths. And I said, "You seem to have a lot of mad inside of you today." And he was underneath his covers. And he said, "I'm not mad, I'm sad." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Something's dead that's supposed to be alive." And I was racking my brain. And then I remembered the caterpillar. And I thought, oh. And then I thought about my outsized reaction to his big 6-year-old emotions. And I realized that it was about 3 days before Father's Day. And my father had passed away just a couple of years before that. And it's always a tough time of year, but I'd been swallowing those. And I think when I could name that I was feeling sad too, just like my son, the sense of relief came washing over me. And I went and gave him a hug, and we moved on with our day. And it reminded me again, for the umpteenth time, the power of putting a name to the emotions swirling inside of us. And when I told this story to a group of 7th graders last year, one of them said something so profound, I just want every parent in America to tack this up on their wall or put it in their phone to look at. And she said, "I wish my parents would remember that when I get mad at them, it's almost always because I'm stressed about something else." So tonight I want to talk about a little bit about the science of emotion, because what we see in our kids that's often triggering to us, often it's when there are things like they're getting angry at us or they're yelling. Usually that's a tip of the iceberg emotion. And if we can get curious about what's underneath, it helps them, and it definitely helps family life as well. So as we're going to talk about tonight, our kids really need help naming their emotions. That's your emotional vocabulary. Normalizing emotions to know that all emotions are healthy. There's no such thing as a good or bad emotion. And finally, navigating emotions. But a chunk of this conversation is going to stick with naming. And I love this visual from the Instagrammer Worry Lines about sad. And I want to get interactive here for just a minute. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds. And if you're at your computer, would you mind in the chat for 30 seconds just jotting down emotions, human emotions that come to mind? We'll see how many we can get in the chat. On your mark, get set, go. Okay, stop. That's an incredible list. That's a longer list than most of you have when you were 3 years old, right? When the core emotions were happy, sad, scared, and mad. So now I'm going to take it a little more granular. And I want you, let's go back to this kind of image from before, where we have, big sad, small sad. Without adjectives, how many different words, how many different degrees, synonyms for sad, just that human emotion of sadness? What are other more specific words to describe sad? Go. And stop. So I want to take a few of these. I have things like dejected, anguished, low, depressed, lonely, down, frustrated, grief. I did this exercise with a group of second graders recently, and the very first word that came up from someone was grief. And I said, well, what is grief? And the second grader said, it's when you lose something that really, really, really matters to you. And then I said, okay, give me another word. And somebody said, sometimes when I'm sad, I just kind of feel like frustrated or irritated, and it makes me sad. And for them to be able to talk about the difference between I'm feeling disappointed that my team lost the game, and I'm feeling anguished that, I lost my pet, those are really great distinctions. And I'll tell you why. I want to introduce you to a term that for me has been just so helpful in how I think about emotion and how I think about communicating this to my children and students. And that term is emotional granularity. And Lisa Feldman Barrett, who is a professor at Northeastern University, is the one who coined this term. And basically, it's the ability to put feelings into words with a high degree of specificity and precision. So my son was beginning this when he could articulate that he wasn't mad, he was sad. Now, as she says from her research, this is her book, How Emotions Are Made, that people who can distinguish between their unpleasant feelings, the 50 shades of feeling crappy, when people could speak this way, they were 30% more flexible when regulating their emotions. That means they could make better choices. They were less likely to drink excessively when stressed, and less likely to retaliate aggressively against someone who had hurt them. Now, these are all things we want for our kids, correct? To be emotionally agile, to not turn to substance use or other forms of self-medicating when they're stressed, and to not act out aggressively. All of these are outcomes that we really would want, especially as these adolescents moving forward. So a couple of tools that I found helpful with my students and my own children and myself to begin to develop that emotional vocabulary are things like feelings wheels, where the inside are your emotions that we're trying to get our 2- and 3-year-olds to understand: happy, mad, sad, and scared. But then to realize that, there are different degrees of sad. There are different degrees of angry. There's irate and there's frustrated. Those are different words. Those are different feelings. And this can become particularly helpful even in helping kids to understand their friends and develop empathy, because take something like surprise. Now, surprise, if I were to say to a group of students, I have a surprise for you, I have a group of students for whom that is an energizing feeling. They get eager, they are happy, they want to know what's about to happen. I have other students for whom they are instantly uncomfortable. I'm thinking particularly of some of my students who may be autistic, for whom routine is an absolute comfort and even a necessity sometimes for getting through the day and keep their self-regulation. That's really important when somebody wants to throw a surprise party for a friend, to be able to say, now, are you sure your friend's going to like a surprise? Let's think about how they might be feeling, and to begin to get a little bit more granular. Another visual to help understand this idea of emotional granularity comes from Susan David, who wrote a book called Emotional Agility. She's become a good friend of mine, and she uses the umbrella imagery, where she says, you have the umbrella emotion like happy or sad, and then what you want to try to do is think about the raindrops underneath what's under the umbrella that falls in the same category, like thankful, content, comfortable, excited, elated. Again, developing that vocabulary. So how do we start at a very young age helping kids develop this vocabulary? Now that we know that the ability to use this vocabulary becomes quite important for our own self-regulation. One strategy, particularly for the young ones, that has research behind it is to read books together. And not just to read the books, but to pause while you're reading and to talk about the emotions of the people on the page. What do you see? Picture books are so great for this because you can stop and look at the pictures and you read the pictures with your kids. Super important for your children who maybe struggle with reading body language to be able to begin to see it initially in books. So I thought about this very purposefully with the first two books in my series, I Love You All the Time and You Have Feelings All the Time. And I want to just very quickly share with you the backstory to I Love You All the Time. And my oldest, when she was 3, had just a tremendously massive meltdown one day. And I used all my tricks and nothing was working and I couldn't get her to calm down. And I was getting near my fraying point. And finally, I scooped her up and I put her on my lap. And I looked at her and I said, I really love you when you're mad. And she looked at me like what has happened to my mom? She didn't understand that. So I kept going. She had calmed down a bit. So I said, I love you when you're happy. I love you when you're sad. I love you when you're scared. I love you when you're mad. I love you all the time. And that became the mantra that I would say to my kids before bed for years before I turned this into a book. And of course, as especially my younger child got older, he would begin to test that and say, well, what if I chopped down your favorite tree? Would you still love me then? And I would say, I might feel sad about the tree. I might feel upset that it happened, but I would still love you. And that normalizing, right? That our love, their worth, their goodness is not dependent on their emotions is really powerful. And I think even as adults, sometimes we still think, I'm not lovable if I'm not happy or if I'm not positive. And to communicate this to our kids, that we're not just going to put you away in your room in timeout if you are angry, that we can work this out together. You might need some calm down time, but that you're not being kind of pushed away when you're having uncomfortable emotions. That helps them see that all of their emotions are valid because all emotions serve some purpose. As my friend Susan David says, emotions are data. They're not directives. They don't tell you what to do. They don't force you to hit your sister if you're mad, but they do tell you that you're feeling angry for some reason. Is that because you're hungry? Is that because someone hurt your feelings? Could be any number of things, but our emotions give us data. And that is really worth exploring. This is the last page of my book, You Have Feelings All the Time, which is the release of the butterflies. And neighbors, teachers, parents, friends have lots of feelings too. We laugh and cry, we smile and sigh, we feel just like you. And I love showing this spread to when I go speak with preschoolers, because it's one of those moments where you first think everybody's happy because it's the butterflies being released. It's an exciting moment. But if you look closer, I ask them, how many different feelings do you see on this page? And they see a crying baby, and they see a man who's scared and covering his head, and they see a kid who's really curious, and they see a girl who's very peaceful with a butterfly on her finger. And they see lots of emotions to the same stimulus, so that even if everyone's experiencing the same thing, people are going to have different emotions, and that's okay. So that's the beginning of normalizing, especially for young kids, to be able to build that vocabulary and normalize that we all have feelings all the time. My next piece of advice for helping them build vocabulary really falls on us and practice. And this is not always easy because sometimes it's going to require getting into the habit of saying and responding in ways that maybe we haven't been trained to do from when we were children. But the more I've practiced this over my 12 years of being a parent, the easier this has become. And I want to share with you a few concrete ideas for how to practice talking about emotions. I'm going to start with, for those you might have, the 3 to 8 year olds. And when my daughter was 5, she was a budding perfectionist and would get super frustrated if she ever made any mistake. And so I said to her, every single day, I want you to share one thing you did wrong, one mistake. We'll call it your oops. And I'll share something I did, a mistake I made, and then we'll give each other a high five. We'll say, what was your oops today? And so after we did that for a while, we decided we didn't just want to share mistakes. We also wanted to share a good thing that happened that day, a yay for the day. So it became, what was your yay? What was your oops? But then there was a day where she said, something happened on the playground today, Mom, and it wasn't really a yay or an oops because I didn't make a mistake, something, it was more of a blah. And so we added blah to that, a yay, an oops, and a blah. This became an awesome framework for years for sharing our emotions of the day in a concrete way. What was your yay? What was your oops? What was your blah? Because for one, it normalized that every day has its ups and downs. When I asked the same group of 7th graders last year, when your parents ask you, how was your day? What do you say? You all know what they said. They said, fine. So, well, why do you say fine? Well, there were a couple of reasons. One, sometimes it was the end of the day. They were tired. They didn't want to be grilled, right? They're having they're overstimulated. And 2, a lot happens in a day. So if you say, how was your day? There are ups, there are downs. You just say fine. It's easier that way. The nice thing about this framework, especially the blah, is that it really helped, particularly my younger child, to be able to share uncomfortable emotions because I was sharing them first. And so I became quite used to him at the end of the day, sometimes at bedtime, saying, Mom, did you have any blahs today? And I'd think back and I would have to find something because we all share. And so I might share a frustration that I had, or, something that didn't go quite right, or running late for a meeting. And then inevitably, after I shared that, he'd say, I need to tell you, my teacher had to talk to me today because blank, or my friend on the playground said blank. But by me being willing to share the downs of my day, it gave permission and it normalized my children sharing them as well. So, especially as your kids get older, here are some other phrases that I found particularly helpful in just normalizing emotions and talking about emotions. Because, one thing I've truly believe from my 20 plus years in education is that most kids want the best for themselves and the people around them. They're good kids. The question is, what are the sources of interference? Like, what gets in the way of them making those good choices? And so often it's something happening emotionally within them. And so if we can kind of get to those emotions and talk about them, we're more likely to help them be able to make those good choices. So here are some of those phrases. You don't need to memorize these. What I would say is, as I go through this list, pick one that you could imagine yourself saying and write it down and try saying it once this week and see how it goes. Here's one. I notice that you seem a little anxious. You seem extra tired today. You seem blank. Do you want to talk about it? Even if they don't, they know you've seen them. That's a big thing for especially teenagers. I can see why you're upset, frustrated, or hurt. That's a great thing to say before you say, but you can't use that language, right? Acknowledge the emotion first. I can see why that would make you so upset. I can see why you're so frustrated at your brother. I think I get it. After they share a long story, are you saying, and then maybe try to reflect back to them what you're hearing them say, both what happened and the emotion behind it. Sometimes if my students or a child tells me a long story, I might suddenly hear them just mention, I remember one day my son was having a bad day, and then he suddenly mentioned that there was a substitute. And I said, oh, tell me more about Mrs. B being gone today. And that opened up a whole new realm of conversation. Empathy. If that happened to me, I'd be upset too, or I'd be delighted too. I would be nervous too. And this last one is from the wonderful Lisa D'Amour, who I've just found out has a new book about the emotions of teenagers coming out in February. And this is a magical phrase, and it's simply this: that stinks. How do you want to handle it? The beauty of this phrase is that it acknowledges that this is not something that was pleasant, that stinks, that's frustrating, that's blank, but it also shows your confidence that they can move through it. And so this is a great one if you have a child who's not in the middle of an emotional storm, but they've been frustrated with something happening with their drama teacher or a friend situation. You're like, that stinks. How do you want to handle it? And it puts the problem solving back on them with you as a good listener. And it takes away your responsibility to problem solve for them. They've been heard. And now you're saying, I see the frustration and I trust your capacity to work through this emotion toward a good aim. The other phrase that I keep in my mind, especially when I'm feeling emotionally not at my best, comes from Dr. Mark Brackett, who is the director of the Yale Child Study Center. And I've had a chance to interview him a few times. A wonderful book called Permission to Feel that he wrote a few years ago. And he talks about becoming an emotions scientist. What does a scientist do? A scientist experiments, observes, notices, stays non-judgmental. The contrast to this, he says, which so many of us grew up with, is being an emotions judge. You shouldn't feel that way. I can't believe you said that. I can't believe you're upset about that. Everything's going so well. You're ungrateful if you're not feeling happy right now. To be judging the uncomfortable emotions. Becoming an emotions scientist means there's something that doesn't feel right in me, or I'm noticing that my child is out of sorts. There's a visible emotion, the most apparent one. And then it's beginning to ask the questions of what's beneath the surface. Okay, so like we said before, my kid seems sad. Then take a look at all those other words you put down. Are they sad? Or are they, are they lonely? Is my child angry? Or are they confused? Is the anger about math homework because they're not understanding the math homework and they're feeling confused? Well, if you can, work on the confusion, the anger begins to dissipate. So when I interviewed him for a recent Washington Post article, he described how he was bullied incessantly growing up. And so he began to act out at home and with a refusal to go to school. And he said, the more I screamed and said, I don't want to go, the more my parents punished me. Then he said this remarkable phrase. He said, for so long, I was being punished for not knowing how to express or communicate what was really going on inside of me. And I think for some of us as adults, that sentence right there is a little bit of therapy, right? That we were judged or punished or treated in a certain way because we just didn't know how to express our needs. And what we really needed was somebody who was willing to get curious, to become a compassionate emotion scientist or curious explorers of our kids' experiences. So a phrase that, if you remember nothing else from this talk, but these two words, these are my go-to words when I'm not sure how to start a conversation, but I know that I need to with a student or with one of my kids. And it's simply, I noticed. Because I truly believe that our kids need us to see them, to see their emotional state, to see what is going on. And I noticed says, I'm curious about you. So I noticed you haven't been as excited about track practice recently. So I'm not yelling at you for not getting out the door on time. I'm not saying I can't believe that, I'm spending all this money on this extra track team and, you're not going, that's so ungrateful. I'm just noticing. And I'm giving the space for you to talk about why or to even explore it yourself. I noticed you seemed pretty upset when you got home from the party last night. I noticed you've been more frustrated with your little brother than usual. This is a phrase that I've had to use in this last week when my instinct is to say, what you just said was really mean. You need to go apologize to your brother. And when I phrase it as I noticed, it gives space for the other child to share some of what has been triggering or prompting their emotions when perhaps I'm only seeing a piece of the story. So it's wonderful to talk about, these words, but that doesn't mean that in navigating these emotions, it's going to be neat or clean, because human emotions aren't. There is no formula that is going to help your kid not feel uncomfortable emotions, and you wouldn't want them to. As we know, deep in our hearts, even though it's hard, challenges that kids face are things that help them grow. That if they never have a chance to work through uncomfortable emotions, then they never really they won't have that practice ground before they leave us for when they encounter those inevitable disappointments later. And so having a safe space to be able to say, yeah, I am frustrated, I am this, I am that, and try to figure out what to do about it is one of the best gifts we can give our kids. So after naming and normalizing, I want to give a couple of thoughts about helping kids navigate these big emotions that they feel. And this is some education I like to provide kids, because I think it's part of our job as parents to help kids understand what emotions are, to help them understand what can trigger uncomfortable emotions and what can help them feel better when they start to feel overwhelmed. So one acronym that I developed to teach to middle school students a few years ago that seemed helpful, which is HOSE, turning down the fire hose. So sometimes when we're upset, it can feel like taking a hose into the face, right? We're overwhelmed, everything's coming at us at once. So HOSE is HOSE. And the first one, these are questions you can ask yourself. H, am I hungry? We know that, am I thirsty? Sometimes I think I'm so upset and I really want to write that angry email, and I have a snack and my emotions begin to settle down and I have a better perspective on how to handle a situation. O is overstimulation. We know this of our 3-year-olds at the zoo, right? That at some point they are overstimulated and the tantrum is going to happen. They'll be overwhelmed. They need to go home, or the birthday party. But this is also true for our older kids. They have a really packed day at school. And when they come home, may not be the best time to grill them with questions about their day, because they may be overstimulated and need a snack and a little bit of downtime. And if they get in the car and they're really upset about something that happened at school, you want to give time for those emotions to begin to settle, for the fire hose to be turned down before you problem solve with them, because problem solving is so much easier when you're not in that initial state of fight or flight. If you have a child who is on the introverted temperament, then this is particularly important after school. They have used up most of their energy being in a very social environment, and the ability to have quiet time to recharge is very key for them to be able to navigate in the evening. And if you're an introvert yourself, you may have noticed and figured out how to structure these quiet times to recharge, and how overstimulated you can get if you don't build that in. S stands for sleep. When we don't have enough sleep, our emotional regulation is off. And when I talk about sleep to students, to adolescents, they know this. They know that they are not at their best. They know they overreact. They know they cry more. They know that they're angrier when they haven't had sleep. And so this is one reason California just changed its start times for teenagers at school, because sleep is really, really vital for emotional regulation. And then finally, exercise, moving your body, that can release, endorphins and things that can help you once it can be emotionally regulated. And being in nature does that too. So that walk with the dog around the block after school can really help turn down the fire hose, so that then you can take a deep breath and begin to problem solve. Another phrase that I found helpful in teaching kids to say themselves, and for me to say to myself, is to turn "I'm noticing" inward. I'm noticing that I'm feeling stressed. Why is that different than "I'm feeling so stressed"? when you say I am mad, sometimes it can almost feel like it's your identity, it's owning you. When you say I'm noticing that I'm feeling angry, it gives a little distance between you and the emotion. And in that distance is where curiosity comes in. And so, this is an exercise I've kind of trained myself to do, sometimes more successfully than others. When I'm in the car and I'm making breakfast for my kids and suddenly I feel a spike of anxiety. And so I'll say, I'm noticing that I'm feeling irritated. Maybe this is because of that email that's been nagging me that I haven't responded to. Blank might help me feel 1% better. And this is a great one, this last one for kids when they share something and they just feel really down. Our temptation is to try to solve it in the moment. And it's sometimes more helpful to say, what would help you feel 1% better right now? Would going downstairs and having a cup of tea help you feel 1% better? Because anything that helps 1% gets you a little bit closer to working through the emotion and being in problem solving mode. And this next strategy is a recent one, and I'm fascinated by it. And it's simply this, that when you are feeling emotions spike as a parent, and you will many times, try talking about yourself in the third person. So you might say something like this: take a deep breath, Deborah. He's overtired, and so are you. He needs you to stay calm. Why does it work to talk about yourself in the third person versus me saying to myself, I need to calm down? Well, I recently talked to Dr. Ethan Kross, who's a psychologist who studies our mental voices. And he says that when we're upset, anything that helps us zoom out and see the situation from kind of 30,000 feet helps us, regulate our emotions. And for some reason, calling yourself in third person kind of activates that distance in the brain. It's almost like you've made yourself a character in a story. Now, when he told me this, and this I interviewed him about a month ago, I thought back to an interview I had with Mark Brackett a year ago, where he said that when he's feeling activated, he says to himself, Mark, what would the director of emotional intelligence at Yale University, how would he handle this situation? In other words, he says, I, like everybody else, lose my cool with my kids. So sometimes I have to call on my better angel in a moment. And instead of, screaming at them, I might have say, Mark, how would this person handle the situation? And that person's me. But by using the third person, it helps get a little bit of distance. I thought that was a really cool hack, so I wanted to share that. And finally, I'm a really big believer, even at a young age, of giving kids a little bit of knowledge about their brain. And so, you can talk about, whether you use these words, but you have a part of your brain, the amygdala, that, is trying to protect you. So it's looking at threats in the environment. So that might be if there's a car speeding down the road, and that part of your brain is going to say, jump out of the way. It's not going to wait for the reason part of your brain to calculate the speed of the car. No, it's designed to protect you, to keep you safe. Ultimately, stress is actually the stress response designed to keep you alive, right? But, as I say to kids, the three, as you all know, most common responses to stress are to fight, to flee, or to freeze. There's also a fourth one we talk about now sometimes, but it's to fawn, which is to people please, you sometimes see. And you'll see this reaction. Obviously, this is protective in an evolutionary sense, right? If you have a tiger coming towards you, are you going to fight it? Are you going to flee? Are you going to freeze? But when you have a child doing their homework and they're fighting you, or they are running away to screens, or they are just freezing up and unable to work, that's not helpful. And so, this part of the brain that kind of assesses threat response and makes you want to fight, freeze, or flee, I talk to kids that's like the fire alarm. So when the fire alarm goes off at school, you don't ask too many questions, you go. You get out of the building. Now, maybe there's a real fire, or maybe somebody in the faculty lounge left the microwave popcorn in for too long and it's smoking things up. You don't know, so you move. The other part of your brain that we want to get back online, right? So you're panicking, you're not sure what to do. Your kid comes home, they're super upset, they're completely panicked, the fire alarms are going off. You want to get it back to the watchtower, which is going to look out and say, okay, is this a real fire? Do we need to send in reinforcements? Do we need to strategize? Oh, okay, no, it's just the popcorn, we can stand down. To get to that spot, the visual I have for that is like your glitter jar. That when you have a child, a 2-year-old at Target who's tantruming on the floor, or a teenager who comes home so upset that a friend said something mean and they are beside themselves crying, it's like a jar of glitter that's been shaken up really, really hard. And while that is shaken up, all those emotions and that stress response, that is not the time to problem solve. That's not the time to reason with your 2-year-old. That is not the time to write a pros and cons list with your teenager while they're crying. You have to wait for the glitter to settle, right? That might mean just sitting with them, holding them, going on a walk, getting a cup of tea, because it will settle. Our brains don't stay in a state of stress like that for too long. After a while, it'll settle down, and then you can begin to problem solve. Deep breathing helps with that, to bring that initial emotional flare back down. So this idea of settling your glitter can be just a nice phrase to use with kids to remember that, when you're feeling that way, take the time to get through it. Once you're through it, then the problem solving can happen. So just to kind of sum up some key points that I think are so important to communicate to kids of any age, they'd really simply be this: that your emotions have names. And when you can name your emotions, you can, it's powerful. You can help tame them. You can make better choices. Emotions are normal, all of them. There's no such thing as a good or bad emotion. All humans have all emotions. They're there for a reason. If you never felt fear, you wouldn't be, it would not be as safe to never feel fear. If you never felt anger, then you probably don't truly care about anything. Emotions pass. Really key for middle schoolers and high schoolers who think that whatever they're feeling is going to last forever. And finally, when you feel overwhelmed by your feelings or life in general, I'm here to help you. I'm in it with you. I'm not going to punish you for feeling what you feel. I'm going to be here to help you navigate this situation. So I'm going to stop there. And Charlene, look at that. I'm exactly on time. You think I taught 45-minute classes in school for years or something? I have an internal clock that says 45 minutes.
Oh, Deborah, it's very easy to do this work with someone like you. That was just wonderful. So many things to think about, parents. And I will tell you, I have 2 young adult kids and just became a grandmother 6 months ago. And everything she's saying is true. It works. So look at that. And again, we love these emojis. All right, I'm going to give you a heart too, Deborah. There we go. That's so fun, isn't it? All right, let's wind it back to the beginning, because I thought that was a really important point that you made at the start. Parent says, my teen often seems angry for no apparent reason. Do you think it's because they're feeling stressed or overwhelmed? How can I tell?
Yeah, I mean, and here's the thing, your teen may not actually know either. That I remember once an 8th grader, when I taught 8th grade, she came in to talk to me and she said, I don't know what's going on. I just keep slamming the door in my dad's face and he keeps getting mad at me and I keep doing it and I don't know why, right? The one thing you need to know about the adolescent brain is that the side that processes emotions is growing faster than the watchtower side. And so there's a reason we have such strong memories of our middle school years. We have, the emotional side is particularly pronounced and for teenagers, and that's awesome. They're developing, they can use this as a bit of a superpower. But if you're noticing your kid being upset all the time, there's some things to think about. You know, you want to keep the lines of communication open, and that doesn't mean they'll talk when you want them to talk.
Yeah.
So I found, especially with teens, often going on a walk where you don't have to make eye contact, or when they're in the back seat, or you're driving, you're playing a game that they love to play, something that it feels like is taking the heat, you're not grilling them, can be really helpful. Using the I notice phrase, you know, hey, I just noticed you seem a bit upset recently. If you ever want to talk about it, you know, trying to be perceptive on what you see. But this is where quality time and just being there and letting them know that you care can go a long way. The other thing is that it's not the emotions necessarily that are, you know, that aren't good or bad, but you want to be looking at their coping strategies. And so, do they have coping strategies? And, you know, they may not be your coping strategies, but, you know, if they're moderately healthy, that might be talking to friends, listening to good music, going on a run. If you start seeing things like substance use or self-harm, then you know you're at a different level. Then you know you want to get, you know, some more intervention and support for them. But one of the things at this age for teens is to, you know, also increase the size of your village. And so, you know, if they have an advisor at school, or they have a coach who knows them well, to share your observations, see what they're seeing too. Because, you know, if you're having that instinct as a parent and you're wondering if you're missing something, using your village, not to spy on your child, but just to kind of gather that brain trust, can be helpful too.
That's really good advice. Like, we had Anna Hamoyan this week, and she mentioned that, you know, it's good to outsource. An uncle or aunt or grandparent can be a good person to talk to when the parents have kind of just had it, you know.
Yeah.
So outsource some of these conversations with your kids. All right, so many good questions coming in, Deborah, and people are like, fantastic session, truly appreciate it. Here's a good one. What is your recommendation to get a child, 8-year-old, who has a hard time talking about feelings and what's going on with him?
So I have an 8-year-old, so I get this very well. Sometimes it's not about asking a specific question, but about it. Sometimes the structure helps. Like the yay oops blah still works really well with my 8-year-old, right? Sometimes we do it as a joke, but I might share something and see if they want to share back. Or if I hear from a friend, it's like, oh, I heard from so-and-so that you're studying blank at school. It opens up the line of communication. But something else that sometimes really helps is to simply sit with your kid and do something that they love to do at that age. And so I find that when I sit, don't judge me as a parent, but he loves Survivor, the show. We have so many conversations about emotions and choices from watching Survivor and the contestants, because it depersonalizes a little bit. And sometimes he'll tell me stuff that's happened with friends like 2 weeks later because something happened on the episode of Survivor that we watched together. We also still read books every night together. And I find that that's a nice quiet time right before bed. I get 90% of my intel right before bed from this particular child. And again, like kids don't share on demand. We wish they did. Be like, come home, share your day. That's not how it works. And so, right now it's bedtime that this is working, and that cuddle time. When he's 10, it might be something very different. And I might be, looking for a different strategy and a time with him.
So true, Deborah. And I want to also reiterate to parents that this video is being recorded and will be available soon on our free video library. So never fear, you can rewatch it, you can share it, you can share with a partner. And also that the tips that Deborah is giving tonight are really important. Your kid may be 8 now, but soon they'll be 18 and then 28. So you want to settle into those relationships early on so that when you need to communicate more when they're teenagers, you have that relationship. Just my 2 cents worth. All right, Deborah, tips on how to start these approaches with older teens, especially those who are reluctant to share their feelings.
I think often with older teens, it helps if you share it first. And that, and it may just be, like, I'm going to sit down and share my feelings, but we may be making dinner together, right? And be like, I am so frustrated by something that happened at work today. Can you help me brainstorm through it? Asking our kids for advice can be really a great entry point. And not only that, they have great ideas. So there may be times where I say, I'm feeling really nervous about this presentation I have to give tomorrow. Can I run an idea by you? Yeah. And that, kids like to feel useful. And so sometimes if I'm willing to be a little vulnerable, we can't expect our kids to share if we're unwilling to share ourselves. That doesn't mean they have to know all of our adult worries, but our goal is to get them ready for adult life. And so I think them seeing some of what we go through, asking for their advice, it's a small thing, but I get my 11-year-old to help make some of my graphics for social media.
I know you do.
It's fun with Canva. And you know what I do? I put in quotes for her to do that I want to talk to her about. And so I'll find a quote that I think she'll like, and I'll put it in, and she'll be designing it. So it's a kind of a covert way to do it, but it's a way that she feels useful. She is useful. It's not just a play. They're beautiful. She does a better job than me, but it's an entry in. And I will also say with the older teens that if you can get curious about what they're curious about, it goes a long way. Get curious about their music, get curious about, what they're studying. Doesn't mean you have to grill them, but if they sense, if they're playing video games and your only conversation about video games is get off screens, and you never get curious about what they like about the game, then they might have a whole emotional life attached to the game. And you're shutting down any conversation things that you could learn about your child. And so this idea of being an emotion scientist and getting curious applies to just about everything in our kids' lives, because part of what we're trying to do is, they're not mini-me's. They have their own personalities, their own interests, and it's a discovery process.
That is really great advice. I know that our friend Bill Stixard would say the same thing, Deborah, that it surprises parents to hear that we should ask our kids for advice. But it really works, especially with teenagers. Really great advice. All right, let's go ahead.
Well, I'd say one other great technique sometimes with if a student, if they do share something with you and they don't know what to do, ask them, what advice would you give to your best friend? Because if they can articulate, that's not zooming out. Sometimes they have a better job articulating it to somebody else than they do to themselves. So they might say, well, I told my friend, don't worry about it. Everybody, messes up sometimes. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what they need to hear for themselves. So that can be a fun strategy too.
And parents, kids will play along with that. I've tried it even with my adult daughter. What would your friends say? They will give you that information if you give them the chance. And then usually they'll say, yeah, I've been pretty mean to myself. Right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's roll the clock back a little bit. Parent asks, how do I increase my 4-year-old's emotional vocabulary? I'm not the best at it either, so it's something we would both be learning.
So at that age, it's great. I'm going to give you 3 very concrete things. 1, read together. Read picture books, but stop and look at the pictures. 2, if you haven't discovered it yet, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood. I'm a big fan. I know I work for PBS, but they're not paying me to say any of this. That's a show that is designed to help increase kids' emotional vocabulary. And so that's a really good one for your 2, 3, and 4-year-olds to sit and watch together. And then another one is, their vocabulary is going to be limited. So one thing I do with this age is to say, you're mad, you're frustrated because, and so I give them a synonym of, oh, you seem sad, you seem upset because, or, you're, look how happy you are, you're excited because. And so I'm taking a look at their emotions and I'm interpreting, and sometimes they will say to me, I'm not that, I'm this, but that's fine, that's good. Like my son saying, I'm not mad, I'm sad. But beginning to try to look at their behavior and saying, it seems like you might be blank, and using one of those good emotion words, that's how they learn language. They learn it from listening to us.
Are there emotion wheels for young kids, Deborah?
Most of the emotion wheels are, for slightly older, but you can find things like the umbrella, even some of those are bigger words. You can Google it, maybe. Yeah, there might be. I would look. I don't know in particular of one, but it's the type of thing you can actually make your own. You can do something like, okay, let's find 3 good words for mad. So I gave some professional development to a preschool, and they did exactly that. They, once a week, they put up one of the core words like mad and said, let's brainstorm. And then by the end, they had so many words, and as kids walked in, they touched what word they were feeling that day. And so that's the type of thing, right? If you have younger kids, sometimes, especially maybe you have a child who's not super verbal, maybe they can just touch how they're feeling, like slap it on the wall. If you have a 4-year-old, I'm feeling frustrated, and you can touch how you're feeling.
Absolutely. And Deborah, if you would just again, tell us the name of your new book series, because I highly recommend parents, if you have young kids or even ones that are starting to read on their own, they are wonderful books. So Deborah, tell us.
It's the All the Time series. The first one is I Love You All the Time. The second is You Have Feelings All the Time. The third one is You Wonder All the Time. And the last one comes out in November, and it's You're Growing All the Time, which is about all the way kids are growing on the inside as well as the outside.
That's just wonderful. Thank you, Deborah. All right, let's see. We have a few minutes for a couple more questions. Here's one. I think this is interesting. My partner and I have very different emotional temperaments. He tends to be really calm, and I tend to be more volatile and hot-tempered. Is this confusing for our kids that we express emotions so differently?
Not necessarily, because they're going to encounter people in their life who express emotions very differently. I think it becomes an issue if one of you is judging the other and saying to you, your child, don't be like mom or don't be like dad. Like if it's a source of conflict, you want to be working on that. But sometimes it can be something that you discuss. So for example, different things trigger me and my spouse and my kids. We make it a joke sometimes of like, oh, if we're lost, dad's going to be really upset. He doesn't like that feeling of being lost. That triggers his stress response. One of the things they know I hate is I hate being late. And so the other day I was in the car and I misjudged the appointment for a haircut, right? And they called me saying, why aren't you here? And I was on the way. And I talked through the whole thing with my daughter. I was like, my stress response is rising. You can see, like, I want to speed. I'm trying not to. I hate being late. She started to just crack up because in real time, she was seeing like my heart rate go up, but I was talking it through. And that is just, if we can start doing more of that with our kids, then we're demystifying the process because we're human. This is not a talk about don't get mad at your kids ever. I'm a big believer that we will get mad and hopefully we will apologize and say, hey, you know what? I got really mad this morning. I'd gotten an email from work that I was stressed about. It wasn't your fault that I snapped. I want you to know I'm sorry. And that goes a long way.
That's fantastic. Here's a parent who just said, one of the best parenting seminars I've attended in years. A huge thank you. Wish this was a national offering. I will tell you, our program reaches parents in 47 states and 44 countries. So it is indeed a national offering. And Deborah is actually in Boston. So yes.
My kids are asleep upstairs. Hopefully they're asleep.
There you go. All right. One last question, and then I'm going to give you a minute for a final word. Okay, Deborah? This is an important question. Do you have any particular recommendations for helping with kids' emotions who live in split households?
Making space for them to talk about it. I've some kids who are going between houses sometimes feel like they have to be one way in one and one way in the other. Mm-hmm. And I think making space for them to talk about, and as you mentioned earlier, to pull in your team. And so who are the people in their lives that are constant, that are in neither household? So a grandparent, a teacher, and that can just, one of the great things about, going to multiple households is they're learning skills, right? They're learning how to be flexible. Challenges that kids face are opportunities. And so if they're going between 2 households, that can be a great opportunity for them to be learning some flexibility. Just keep the door open for communication.
That's a lovely answer, Deborah. And again, thank you for everybody's, Long Island is in the house here, Deborah. We are so grateful to all of you and for all the wonderful questions, for everybody who joined us tonight. Deborah, I want to give you a chance for some final words to parents, just something you want us to walk away with.
I think I always love closing with Fred Rogers, who my last book is dedicated to. And when he talks about emotions, he says that what's mentionable is manageable. And for me, that means if we can talk about it, then we can figure it out together. And I think sometimes if we feel like, no, I can't share that, that's the very time to find somebody to share it with. Because when we share and feel safe sharing, that is when, this human magic happens, when we're vulnerable and realize our emotions are just a beautiful part of us.
Thank you so much, Deborah Farmer Kris. That was a perfect place to end with. You just gave me chills. Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and for all your kind comments and all the floating emojis. We love that. Again, thank you, Deborah. We hope to see you again soon. Good night, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.